So in the last lesson, we've successfully tapped into the Open Weather Maps data servers, and we've gotten back the data for the current weather. Now, this weather data is formatted in what's called a JSON format. And what you'll find is that most API providers are split into two camps. They'll either provide you the data in the XML format, the extensible markup language format, or something called a JSON format. And some API providers even give you a choice as to which type of response you would like. And Open Weather Map is one of those types of providers. So you can see here that we're getting our data back in our JSON format, but we can also say that we want the XML mode to get the same data back in the XML style. Now, previously, we've already seen what an XML file looks like when we went into the Android manifest and the iOS plist. So when we take a look at the app, source, main, and we open up our Android manifest, you can see that this is styled in the XML format. And XML looks very similar to HTML if you've ever used that. It's essentially a whole bunch of key value pairs. So the name of the key is the tag, and there's an opening tag and a closing tag. And you can tell that it's a closing tag because it has a / before the key. In between those tags is the actual value of the key. So the key could be something like temperature / temperature, and in the middle it could be 32 or whatever value it might be. Now, JSON, however, stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So it's a format that looks extremely similar to how you would create objects in JavaScript. And the way that it's styled looks something like this. Every key value pair is enclosed in a set of curly braces. And the first part is the key, then there's a colon, and then there's the value. And this looks very similar to the maps that we have in Dart as well. Now, this is our weather data in a JSON format. So, for example, in this case, the coordinates here is the first key, and the value is everything that comes afterwards. So it's the long and the lat. Now you can see that the value for the coordinates itself has a key value pair, where ln is the key and -0.13 is the value. Now, as a human, it's actually quite hard to be able to read this without having it formatted. So a really useful tool is something like a JSON viewer. So this is a Chrome plugin called JSON Viewer Awesome, and it's free to download and add to your Chrome browser. And now if we go back to where we had our JSON data in the response and we hit refresh, you can see that JSON Viewer has now formatted all of that data into a format that's much easier to read as a human. So essentially, we've got a single JSON which contains 12 items. So one of those is coordinates, one is weather, one is base, one is main. But each of these objects then have their own objects inside it. So the coord contains the ln and the lat. The weather contains one item, and the item contains an ID for the weather condition, the weather name, so it's currently drizzling in London, as always, and it's got a description, and you can also view it as a chart, so a whole bunch of nodes. So for example, response goes to coordinates, goes to long, and goes to lat, and when you hover over them, you can view the values like this. So the way that I would view a JSON is it's almost like those flat pack furniture things, where if you were to create, say, a map in Dart, you might write var wardrobe equals, you open up your curly braces, and then you have some key and value pairs. So our wardrobe has 2 doors, it has 2 drawers, and it has the color red. Now, if we were to transport this data across the internet, that's actually quite a lot of characters. How can we make it more flat pack, more like our IKEA furniture? Well, we could probably just have those key and value pairs and take out the rest of the grammar or the syntax. So it might look something like this. And once we've transported this data across the internet, keeping it as small as possible, once it lands on the floor of the location that it needs to be, so in our app, for example, well, then we can unpack it and assemble it back into its original form. So now, if I was to try and unpack the data from our response for the weather, if I, for example, wanted to tap into this value, so the value of the longitude, then what I would have to do is we have to use the help of a Dart package called Dart Convert. And once we import Dart Convert, then we can start using a method that comes from that package called JSON decode. And here we can pass in a source, so a bit of JSON data, and it will try to decode it depending on what values we want. So for example, if I wanted to unpack my JSON here for my weather data, and I wanted to access the value of the longitude here, then I would first take my source, which is going to be the data that I get back as the response body, which we know to be JSON formatted. And then I could provide a key. The first key to get to this longitude is the coord key. So I have to step into here, and then I have to make my step into long before I can tap into this value. So the first key is going to be the string coord, and it's really important that you spell it exactly the same way that you see in the data, otherwise it won't work. Now, after that stage, I now am inside here. And in order to get my actual value, I have to give it the second key, which is long. So I'm going to add another set of square brackets and add the word lon, so spelled exactly the same way as I see here. So now this is going to be equal to the value of the longitude, which is 139.01. And I can now save that into a variable. Let's call that the longitude. And now if I go ahead and print my longitude instead of data, we can see what we actually get from unpacking our JSON data. So let's hit save and let's check out our console. You can see that I'm getting 139.01, exactly the same as here. So I had to step through 2 keys in order to get to that value. Now, if I wanted to get to the weather condition, for example, if I wanted to get the description here. Now here, it's a little bit more tricky. The first step is very easy. Let's create a new variable. Let's call it the weather description. And let's set it to equal, again, we're going to use JSON decode to decode our data. And then we have to pass it some keys. So how do we reach this description? Well, the first step is through the key weather. So let's add that in a square bracket. Now, the next key is not what you might expect. So notice that here we have one arrow, so that's our data, our second arrow, which is our coord, and our third one is simply the key longitude. Here we have our data, then our weather, then we have something here which doesn't actually have a name. So when you collapse our weather, you can see that it's got a list that only contains one item. So to access the first item in a list, what do? Well, we have to use the index of that list for the first value. And we know that lists start counting from 0. So here we have to add a square bracket and add 0 to be able to go into this tree right here. Because notice that this ID is not directly inside the weather, unlike the longitude, which is directly inside the coordinate. So now by adding that 0, we're now inside this tree, and we can now add our final key, which is the description. So making sure that I've actually spelt it right, description. This should now be equal to the weather description. So let's check it by printing it here. Let's print the weather description. And if we hit save, let's check our console, and we're getting clear sky printed in here, which comes from right here. Now, if that seems really, really painful, it's because it's actually the hard way of doing things. And by using something like JSON Viewer Awesome, there's actually a much easier way. So for example, if I wanted to get the main value here, I can click on it, select it, and then in the gutter here, I can click on copy path. So now I can go ahead and paste that in here, and it tells me how to get to that main. So the first key is weather, the second key is 0, the third key is main. So if I wanted to do that, the first key is weather, second is 0, third is main. And now when I hit save, my weather description is going to be clear. So you can use this tool to make it much easier for you to get a value that is quite deep in the tree. So this pressure, for example, exists under main and then pressure, but something like the icon will exist at weather 0 icon. So as a challenge, I want you to create 3 variables inside here. So I'm going to delete everything we've got here. And I want you to create 3 variables that are going to contain the temperature, so this value right here, and then the condition, so this value right here, this is the condition number, and then there's the city name right here, so this one. Pause the video and try to create 3 variables that will contain the data that comes from our JSON response. All right, so first things first, let's try and create our temperature variable. So I'm just going to use a var keyword for now, and I'm going to show you why very, very soon. So I'm going to create a temperature variable, and it's going to be equal to JSON decode, and the source is going to be our data, and then I'm going to add some keys. So our temperature is right here, so I'm going to click on it, copy the path, and put it down here to see how I need to get there. So the first key is going to be called main, and the second key is going to be called temp. So this is my first variable. My second variable is going to be the condition, and this is going to be JSON decode data, and the condition comes from right here, the weather ID. So I'm going to copy the path here and paste it in here. So for this one, I have to access it through weather and then 0 and then ID. For the final one, it's going to be the name. So I'm going to call it city name. And it's going to be equal to, again, JSON decode our data, and then the city name is down here. So let's copy that path and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so it's just a single key, which is going to be the string name. So now I have 3 variables that come from my JSON data, and I've set them all to be variables. So let's hit save. Now, if we wanted to reduce the amount of repetition here, and we actually want to simply decode the data just once, so we could create a new variable called decoded data, and we could set it to equal JSON decode data. Then we can use decoded data in all 3 of these places. And the reason why I'm setting it to a dynamic variable here, so not giving it a type outright, is because if we hit Control J or Control Q on this JSON decode, then you can see the output is a dynamic type. It doesn't know what it's going to be until the data gets processed. So you can either leave everything with a type of dynamic by using the var keyword, or you can look at the data and see what the data type could be. So ID is probably going to be an integer, temperature is probably going to be a double, and name is probably going to be a string. And you could change these to those particular types. So we change this to a double, this to an int, and this to a string. So right now, if I was to print out the temperature and condition and city name, then you can see that I don't actually have any problems here, and there are no incompatibilities. But similarly, had I kept all of those as vars, even though it's less explicit, it still will work as a dynamic type. But if I get the type wrong, say I used a double instead of an int for our condition, then we'll get errors inside here. Let's change this back to the right data types. And I like having the right data type here instead of a var because it makes it more explicit. The only one that we should keep as dynamic is the one for our decoded data, because we really won't know what the type is until the decoding has completed. Now, so far, we've been learning about APIs and JSONs and how to decode our JSONs to actually get the values from the API response. But we've only been working with some dummy data from OpenWeatherMap because we're using samples.OpenWeatherMap rather than their actual API. And we're doing this because we don't yet have an app ID that will authorize us to use their API. So in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to register for your own app ID so that you can start passing over the actual latitudes and longitudes that we're getting from our app to get the data for that location. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.